Hello, friends. Today I am delighted to be joined by Millie Florence. Her earliest memories are of lying under the covers at night long after her parents had told her to go to sleep, whispering stories to herself. Millie published her first book, Honey Butter, at age 13, and she hasn't stopped since. Millie lives in a picturesque blue house in the woods of southern Illinois. She loves adventure, good food, and just about all things yellow. And if you're watching the video, you can see some yellow walls behind her, very sunshiny. You can follow Millie on Facebook or Instagram or see what she's up to at millieflorence.com. All right, Millie, I am so delighted to get to chat with you today. I always begin with those very formal, official biographies. But could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and your personal experience being homeschooled?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hello everyone. I am so delighted to be here on the podcast. I have four younger siblings. I'm the oldest of five, and we have all homeschooled our entire lives. Um, our homeschool style is very eclectic, as my mom has always described it that way. We use a lot of different approaches, different resources, just depending on what worked best for each individual kid, what worked best in the moment. A phrase she likes to use is delight directed. So, our homeschool style very much follows what each of us kids are interested in and passionate about. And for me, that was writing, even publishing a book at 13. So that directed a lot of my homeschool experience. She's also a big fan of Charlotte Mason, and we've done some classical education as well, lots and lots of read alouds, and a big emphasis on conversation. We have lots of conversations in our family and hands-on learning, travel, that sort of thing. So.
I love to hear that. Yes. And our family, well, I was homeschooled growing up. And so all of the wonderful books we read and the conversations, that was such a favorite part of my own homeschooled experience and has definitely come in as I homeschool my own children. I think that's such a beautiful way to learn and grow as a family. Well, what were some of
Absolutely.
your favorite parts of homeschooling?
Oh, so my family has done quite a bit of travel, which has always been a favorite experience for me. My dad has had the opportunities to have some like business trips overseas, and we would often work that into a family trip. Um, so I've been to like England and Italy and Germany. Like often each kid would like take a turn to go with my dad on his business trips to these new places, which was always a super fun experience. And it's interesting because until recently, I never thought about that as like, oh, that was homeschooling, but it totally was. I learned so much from all of those trips. Um, and I think that also just in general speaks to my homeschool experience. Um, my dad always likes to tell the story that at one point, when I was much, much younger, like I was maybe 5 or 6, another adult found out that I was homeschooled and they were like, "Oh, what do you do for homeschool?" And I just said, "Nothing really." Which,
Nothing and everything.
yeah, exactly. Because to me, it didn't feel like like in my mind as a small child, and I think in a lot of people's minds when they think of education of school, you think of sitting at a desk and doing worksheets. But for my family, it was a lot more just hands-on than that, and I almost didn't realize how I was being educated until like later, looking back. I was like, oh, that was totally purposeful. But at the time, to me as a child, it just felt like, oh, we're doing a fun thing now, you know?
Yeah, it's that sneaky learning that mom on the background is like, ha ha ha, I can count this as homeschooling, but don't tell the kids. They're just going to think it's fun.
Exactly.
Well, Millie, I'm sure that there were also challenges as well. And I think that's one of the questions I often ask my guests because we don't want to have a rosy colored picture of homeschooling. Would you say there was anything that was in particular a challenge or something that you didn't like as much about your homeschool years?
I really loved like my homeschool experience in general, but I will say I always struggled with math. That was a huge headache for me growing up. And in some ways it still is. I am very creatively minded, which means I'm not always the best at the I guess left-brained side of things as much. So math was a big struggle for me growing up. I think that was definitely something a lot of tears were shed over, right? Um, But a way that helps a lot, and this is another thing when we talk about my experience of like delight directed learning. Obviously, my thing was writing. I was super into writing, right? So you might think, oh, how can you even connect math to that, right? Um, but through the process of publishing my first book when I was 13 years old, I actually did learn a lot of math from spreadsheets and tracking expenses when I like did book signings and events and calculating rates for shipping like costs when I buy books and how much am I making per book, so therefore how many books do I need to sell to pay for the table I bought at this convention, right? So I feel like most of the math that I learned that has stuck with me the most today is not anything I learned from a workbook. It's things I learned from that experience pursuing a career in fiction writing, which is super interesting.
I love hearing how, in that kind of unique way, you actually probably connected more. You were certainly more motivated. You've had a reason to work on the math. But that was what was able to connect something that you loved with maybe something that wasn't your favorite. But tell us a little bit more about this because, yes, if someone was listening, you did not mishear. She published her first book when she was 13. Tell us how that all came about.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting because I can't remember a time in my life when I just decided, oh, I'm going to be an author now. Like it always sort of felt like the normal next step for me, I guess, because I've been obsessed with telling stories for as long as I can remember. So as a kid, it just felt like obvious. I love to tell stories. What do you do when you love to tell stories? You go and share them with other people by putting them in books that I find in the library. Um, so I always knew I wanted to publish a book. I always knew I wanted to pursue that. I went to my first fiction writing conference when I was 10 years old, and then again when I was 11 years old to the same one. And my struggle, because I always knew I wanted to publish a book, but my struggle was always how do I finish one? Because I had a lot of creative ideas. I had, I kind of bounced between story ideas a lot. Um, and it was hard for me to stick with one and see it out to the end. And it really frustrated me at some point. And I remember before I started writing Honey Butter, like in the year before, I was working on this sci-fi novel that was super long and took place on another planet and like involved all these just like complicated physics and world building. Um, and I had a conversation with my parents about this. I'm like, oh, I want to publish a book someday, but I can never finish one. And I ended up deciding, through conversation with them and just thinking about it a lot as myself, as like a 12, 13-year-old at the time, to try something a little bit shorter and a little bit simpler. And that is how Honey Butter came about. And something that I always used to explain it is I took ballet when I was younger. And one of the things my ballet teacher always said was, I'd rather see a clean single than a dirty double. And she was talking about doing spins, right? When you go up on one toe and you turn around in a circle. And she was saying she'd rather see a dancer do one turn and nail it, do it really well, do it cleanly, than attempt to do two turns, which is more impressive, but do it sloppily. So I kind of took that idea into writing Honey Butter. I said, I want to write something short and simple, but I want to do it excellently. Another way I've heard it put by an author is before you sit down to compose a concerto, play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and make me cry. So that's what I took into writing Honey Butter, and I think that is definitely what allowed me to finish it and then go on to publish it at age 13 was because I chose something simple and short that I could do well and be proud of, and I am still proud of it now at age 21. So yeah, I don't think sometimes you hear like, oh, you don't want to publish too early. Honestly, I think it's less about too early and more about too complicated. I
Mm.
think you're never too young to write something well and put it out in the world, but you might not be ready to write the complicated thing yet, if that makes sense. And then after Honey Butter, I was able to write more complicated, longer stories. I could not have written my fantasy novels that came out next if I had not written Honey Butter first.
You don't have to start by writing the great American novel, right? You can start by just
Exactly.
writing a good, simple story. It's kind of like you don't have to go and do some complicated meal. Sometimes you just want to make that roast and vegetables for your family, and there's something really good and beautiful about that as well. Well, how
Absolutely. Well, and simple, but also I've seen like so many people love honey butter, and I'm still proud of it today. And it even played a part in getting me a book deal, which you might hear about later
yeah,
in the
I want
podcast.
I wanted
Don't
to hear.
underestimate the simple stuff. Yeah.
How did you get from writing Honey Butter to then writing some other works, and now you have a publishing deal with Waxwing Books? Kind of bring us through that story of your writing career and how we got to where you are now.
Absolutely. So I self-published Honey Butter. For those who don't know, there are two main routes of publishing, self-publishing and traditional publishing. Self-publishing is what it sounds like. You do it all yourself, right? You find a print-on-demand service online, usually. I chose Ingram Spark. There are others that will print and distribute your book to, all online retailers. And then everything else cover, interior formatting, proofreading, editing, any interior illustrations, all the things. You have to either do that yourself or hire out to other people. For Honey Butter, I self-published. I was lucky enough that my mom actually used to work as a proofreader at a Christian publishing company before she became a mom. So she helped proofread my book. And then I also submitted a historical fantasy novel to Bandersnatch Books, which is a indie press, and they ended up saying yes, and which was very, very exciting, obviously, because I was like 18 at the time when they said yes to my book, and that was super duper exciting. And traditional publishing is unlike self-publishing. You send the publisher your book, and then they take care of all the things you would normally have to do yourself when you self-publish, which was very cool. Um, but before my third book, the historical fantasy, The Balter Vashon Harper, before that book even came out, um, I was at a convention, a homeschool convention, selling my books in March of, I think it was it 2023, maybe? Yeah. And it had been a long day at the convention because I was standing at the booth all day selling my books. So I was very tired by the end of the day. And I got on the elevator with my dad and my younger sister to go get dinner that night. It goes down a few floors, and then the doors open, and Sarah Mackenzie, the founder of Waxwing Books, steps onto the elevator, which was not something I expected at all in a million years. And I've been a fan of Sarah Mackenzie and her podcast and what she does ever since I was little. Like, me and my mom have listened to her podcast together ever since it started coming out. So in this moment, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm meeting Sarah Mackenzie.
It was
And
it was a
I said,
literal elevator pitch moment.
elevator pitch. Yes, yes, it was. It was a literal elevator pitch. So we had like a 30-second conversation where I basically just said, "Hi, I'm a big fan. I'm an author. I have a booth at the convention. My name is Millie Florence." And that was it. It was 30 seconds. And then I got off the elevator and I was like, what just happened? And I talked with my dad that night. I was like, we decided that I should go to her booth or one of her talks the next day and say, "Hi, remember me from the elevator?" Because that's pretty memorable, right? And I just wanted to be on her podcast at the time because she'd only published picture books at the time, so I didn't even think she would be looking for anything I was writing. Um, and then the next day, before I even had a chance to go to any of her talks or anything, I'm standing at my booth selling my books. All I had was a 30-second conversation in the elevator with her the day before, and a mom comes up to my booth, points to Honey Butter, my first book, and goes, "Can I buy this? Sarah Mackenzie just told me it was phenomenal." Turns out she had looked me up that night, just knowing my name, because I didn't even have business cards on me. She looked me up that night, bought the ebook of Honey Butter, read it, and was recommending it to people the next day at the convention.
That's fantastic.
I know, right? It's honestly crazy to like still I'm like, how did that happen? I don't know. And so obviously after that encounter, I was like, okay, I definitely have to go talk to her now. So I did, and I gave her physical copies of both of my books. And we decided that we should meet up for dinner at another one of the conventions that we were both going to be at. 3 weeks later, we do meet up for dinner at another convention. And, it's like 15 minutes of small talk, and her editor is also there. And then she turns to her editor, and her editor gives her this like nod. And then she turns back to me and goes, "So, we'd like to republish your book." And that is how I got the book deal for Beyond Mulberry Glen.
Oh, wow. What an incredible story. Okay. So tell me a little bit about Beyond Mulberry Glen. So can you give us the elevator pitch for this book? And then tell us what were maybe a favorite piece of it to write, a favorite chapter or so.
Absolutely. So, Beyond Mulberry Glen is the story of 11-year-old Lydia Green, who lives in the magical realm of the Valleylands with her mismatched family of fairies and philosophers. Until one day, that is, when she hears about a mysterious force known as the darkness that dwells within the forest Tenebrae. But not only does it dwell within the forest, it has begun to creep into Lydia's own mind, and that is where the story begins. I originally self-published it when I was 15 years old, and I'm so excited for it to come out now. It has a new cover and some awesome illustrations by Astrid Shekels, and the title's gonna be in gold foil on the
Oh,
printed book. I'm so excited for that.
that's
And
incredible.
it's coming out January 7th, re-releasing, and it's currently available for pre-order. So everyone can go pre-order it and get their own copy.
Oh, definitely. And I will have links to that in the show notes for this episode for sure. Did you have a favorite chapter when you were originally writing the story?
I do. So the chapter that is my favorite from Beyond Mulberry Glen is titled Candle Wax and Paper Stars. And it's the chapter where the main characters all venture into this magical library that has a mind of its own. And the shelves move and shift like a maze to the point that it's like kind of dangerous because people could get lost in this library. And they meet Quill, the hobgoblin, who only speaks in poetry, and he lives in the library. Um, And it was just such a fun chapter to write. There was so many whimsy, like so much whimsy in so many different places of that chapter. And looking back, I feel like that chapter specifically is really where I discovered my voice as a writer, was in that chapter of Beyond Mulberry Glen. And like that is the moment where it kind of clicked with me, clicked for me, like, oh, this is how I want to write. This is what I want my stories to be like and sound like. And it's just a lot of fun. I think readers will really enjoy reading it. I know Quill is like a favorite among people who have read the book already because he's just so much fun.
Well, a whimsical, magical, slightly dangerous library and a character who speaks in poetry. I am here for that. I cannot wait to read the book myself for sure.
Thank you. I'm so excited for everyone to be able to read it and experience it.
Well, Millie, I can imagine a homeschool mom listening to this episode and thinking, oh, I want to instill a love for story in my children. I want to encourage a love of writing. What would you say to that parent? Like, how can they best encourage that love in their children?
Yeah, so I would say focus on promoting creativity and fun first before grammar and spelling. Because I promise you, with grammar and spelling, there is no rush. I think a lot of parents can feel the like pressure for their kid to figure all this out very quickly. And I'm here to tell you it's okay. I actually did very little formal grammar or spelling when I was younger. Like the way I learned to spell things mainly was reading, and I would be typing my books like in the living room, and I would yell over to my mom, "Hey mom, how do you spell breathe or whatever?" And just over and over and over again until I got it. Like that is pretty much how I learned to spell. Was just through experience, right? Because if I'm motivated to finish a story, I want to figure out how to spell it, right? So focus on promoting that creativity and enjoyment first, because that is something so special that a kid has. One of my favorite quotes from Picasso is, "Every child is an artist. The trouble is how to remain an artist as you grow up." Kids have that creativity, foster that creativity. I think there are some kids who don't want to write or don't want to show their parents their stories because they know that the first thing they're going to get is critique. They're going to be immediately met by here's what you're doing wrong, right? So first, the joy. First, get excited with them about the story. First, say, oh, this is so cool. Oh, that's such a good idea. Oh, tell me more, right? And then ask them if they want feedback. Because I can tell you right now, as a professional writer now, I write books and I publish them. There are plenty of times I don't want feedback now as well. My first drafts are often messy, and I will say I'm not ready for anyone to tell me what's wrong with it yet. I just want to finish it. I want to have fun with it first, and eventually I will be. So ask your kids if they want feedback on what they just wrote, or if they just want you to listen, if they just want to share their excitement of this story with you. That's what I would say if you definitely want to encourage joy in writing, encourage a love of storytelling, is start with the love and the joy, and take a breather, take a deep breath. Grammar and spelling will come. Just joy first.
I think that is such brilliant advice for writing and story, and really just pretty much for much of learning, is start with the love and the joy first. And then we can go into the nitty-gritty. Those things matter, of course, but when you have the foundation of the love and the joy and the delight and the wonder, those are all the things that lend the motivation and the desire to improve in some of those mechanics later on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, what about to maybe a young listener who is like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I've always wanted to be a storyteller. I want to be a published author one day. What would be some of the things that that young writer could be doing now, both to develop their craft now and potentially work towards this as a career in the future?
Great question. Okay, so for developing craft now, when you're first starting out, step number one, and this sounds counterintuitive, but focus on quantity over quality. Focus on writing a lot and writing a lot of different things. You will learn more from writing the beginning of 20 different stories than you will from continuously editing one. You will like learn how to write poetry and songs and short stories and all the different genres, fantasy, contemporary, experiment and have fun. Like while you are young is the time for you to experiment, have fun, try a lot of different things, and all of it will teach you how to become a better writer. I know there are so many young writers who they get a specific story idea that they think is amazing, and honestly, most of the time it is amazing. It's great, right? But then they get on it. Or and the problem is they outgrow that idea skill-wise before they have the time to finish it. Because writing a full book takes a long time. So I would encourage kids, don't get stuck on one idea. Like, it is okay. You are not a failure if you realize, okay, I've outgrown this story idea. I'm a better writer in chat on this like chapter 20 than I was on chapter 1. Maybe you should try to write something new with this newfound knowledge, right? Don't limit yourself by getting stuck on one idea, right? And then I would say, so that's for like developing craft. And then I would say when you get to the point where, okay, I want to start thinking about publishing something now, do what I did with Honey Butter, start small. Because start small and do it well, right? And even outside of writing a short, simple book, before I even wrote Honey Butter, I finished and printed out a piece of fan fiction I wrote that I was proud of. You know, I won an online Mother's Day kids writing contest. I submitted poetry to anthologies and I got accepted into one. So like start with those smaller pieces and focus on doing them well, simple and well. So in the beginning, experiment when you're ready to publish, then narrow in on doing something simple well and build from there. That would be my tip for young writers.
It makes me think of the Chesterton quote, and this may not be the exact quote because obviously I don't have it in front of me, but he said something like, "A thing worth doing is worth doing badly." And
Yes.
not right. So not in the sense of we want to do bad work, but if something is worth doing, it's worth doing it, even if we don't think we can do it excellently yet, or we can't let the fear of perfectionism or, well, I won't be able to write the most amazing book ever written when I'm, 8 or 11 or 14 or whatever age, that worry of it not being perfect to somehow keep you from even starting or trying something, which actually is kind of
Absolutely.
like a lifelong lesson too for moms as well, because sometimes we can let that worry of something not being ideal or something not being perfect keep us from even starting just something, something that we actually do is better than the perfect
Exactly.
thing we don't start.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, start out with that messy, beautiful creativity. And this is why you should start out with the messy, beautiful creativity, because once you're ready to publish something, you do have to narrow in, right? So while you can have fun with it and do lots of different things.
Millie, this has been such a great conversation. I'm so glad to get to have met you here and hear a little bit of your story. I can't wait to read Beyond Mulberry Glen, and we'll definitely have that link in the show notes for people to pre-order it themselves. But here at the end, I want to ask you the questions that I ask all of my guests. And so the first is just, what are you personally reading lately?
So I do a lot of read alouds with my younger sister, who is 10 years old. And most recently, we finished reading Detectives in Togas, which is a classic mystery set in ancient Rome, which is a super fun book. We had a blast reading that together. So that was a recent read. And then currently myself, I am reading Red Rex by Matthew Mellema, which was published by Bandersnatch Books, the same company I was published through. I read his first chapter and like introduction, and it was so whimsical and so fun, and it's just delightful so far. So Bandersnatch sent me a free copy, and that's currently what I am reading myself. So.
That is very fun. I'm not familiar with that title, but this is the problem with asking this question is I always end up with an ever expanding to read list, but it's
It
always
never
fun.
ends.
Never ends. Well, the final question, and normally, of course, I'm speaking to homeschool moms or parents and educators, but I thought I would still ask you this question just from the perspective of your experience as the homeschool student. Do you have any tips, or what would be your best piece of advice for turning around a homeschool day that seems to be going all wrong?
I do have tips for that because, like I said at the beginning, I'm the oldest of five siblings. So not only have I experienced for myself homeschool days gone wrong, um, I've seen it in my younger siblings. And my biggest tip for that would be either to read, like do a read aloud together, or take a walk, or both. I think it's often we need a break. And if you come back to it after you've given your brain some time to decompress, it will go so much better. I also think like doing something like reading together, specifically parent and child, is so important for homeschool in general, but especially if it's a frustrating moment, right? I think that like process of experiencing a story together reminds you that you are in it together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it really brings the focus back on that relationship, that shared experience, that we're
Yep.
on the same team, right? That sometimes we can forget on the hard days.
Yes, for sure.
Well, Millie, where can people find you and your books all around the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the place to find everything you need to know about me and my books would definitely be my website, millieflorence.com. And then through there, you can learn about all my books and you can pre-order Beyond Mulberry Glen. Please, please pre-order. Pre-orders are so helpful when a book is coming out. And if you pre-order, you will get some free pre-order goodies, which include some Beyond Mulberry Glen themed stickers, a bookmark. All of this has like the lovely art from Astrid Shekels on it, and a book plate that I signed so you can stick it in the book when you receive it and you get a signed copy, which is super exciting. So millieflorence.com for that. And then I am also on Facebook and Instagram if you want to follow my journey there. And I have an email newsletter if you're not a social media person.
Okay, and I will have links to all those things in the show notes for this episode over at humilityanddoxology.com. I can imagine a pre-order, even though you won't have the actual book, you could get the like pre-order goodies or make like print out the cover and make a little, make your own family book certificate or whatever, stick it in a stocking for a kid for Christmas. That would be such a fun idea. So I hope that lots of families will get to read your new book and follow your journey. And I'm sure you will have many more books for us in the future.
I certainly will.